This wouldn't be a complete elk hunting backcountry shelter video without the tarp. This is for you dorks. All right, so the beard's back and so is hunting season. So I'm just gearing up for spring bear here, and look what I've got here. Got some shelters out. Seam sealing, checking them out, making sure they all work. But what I want to talk about is basically the 3 different types of backcountry elk hunting shelters that you're gonna run into. And of course, you can use these for mule deer, you can use these for bears, but that's kind of incidental use for them. The primary use of this type of shelter is for sure backcountry elk hunting. It could be backpack hunting. It could just be situations where you want to, a pretty small shelter, you want minimal amount of weight. There's a lot of variations to that, even packing on horses, or e-bikes, any of that stuff where you want to limit your weight a little bit to some extent. These 3 different shelters are going to come into play. Now, there's 2 shelters here that I used a ton over my years of elk hunting that are not here. So 1 is your standard wall tent, and then 2 is your true backpack above timberline backpacking tent. I've always used Hilleberg's on the wall tent front. I always use Davis tents. I'll just get that right out of the way right now. If you're road camping, or somewhere where you're packing in with horses, or if you're flying in and weight allows for it, and it's a longer duration hunt, right? So 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 days. Wall tents are king. I'm not even gonna have the argument with you guys. These tents behind me are great, but they are nothing compared to a true, well set up canvas wall tent. Go check out a video, I've got it here, on how I used to set up wall tents. And the reality is it's better than all of these. The problem is it's way bulkier and it's way heavier. The keys to the wall tent are you get a lot of space, you have walls which maximize the use of that space. You have high walls. They can deal with insane amount of weather, much more than these in terms of particularly snow load. But the key one with a wall tent, and you'll see I'm a fan of a dry heat source, a wood stove, and I use the small ones in these type of tents for the most part. But in a wall tent, you can have a real wood stove. That's huge for those long duration hunts. So that's why wall tents rule on a certain type of hunt. Now, on the far other end of the spectrum, we'll knock that one out too because I don't have it here. Your real true, above timberline alpine type of backpacking hunt. I've always used Hilleberg's. I've used their Acto, I believe the Acto model. It's small, it's kind of a pain in the ass to put up. Even for one guy, their 2-person tent is pretty darn snug, but they're bomb-proof in terms of weather. They're super lightweight, and I love them for backpack hunts where I know I'm gonna be above the alpine. The other time that I use those tents is if I'm elk hunting and I'm just spiking out for 1 night, maybe 2 nights. I'll take those type of tents just to save on bulk, save on weight, and save on just simplicity, right? But there's some huge disadvantages that I'm gonna touch on when I go over these tents. Those are really like misery hunts is what I would say. That's how the classification I put them in. So the comforts of these type of tents here, you're not gonna get those on those hunts. And if I need to go in and, kill a bighorn ram or kill a mountain goat, and I only gotta go in 1 night and go basically sleep on those goats or sleep on those sheep, then that's what I'm taking. My client or my hunting partner, he's taking his own in that situation because we may have to set our camp up on, a rock up in some shithole above timberline. So that's the use case there, but let's dive into these. All right, guys, so this here is the 8-man teepee from Kifaru. This is the teepee that I've primarily used for backcountry elk hunting that's this size, right? This is their 8-man teepee, and it's really phenomenal. For 2 guys, it's insane. It's luxurious. For 3 guys, it's pretty damn good. For 4 guys, you can do it, but it's a little bit cramped in there, particularly because just the style of a teepee kind of limits the square footage you've got there. But for those size groups, these things are killer because you've got a lot of space, and then when you account for the weight of the tent, the teepee, plus the pipe and the stove, you're not gonna be able to get a better deal divided up amongst guys. So backpack hunts that you've got 2 or 3 guys, maybe 4 guys that you are good hunting partners and they don't snore, so you can all sleep in the same one. This is your go-to tent. A couple things I'll mention on this. For me personally, I hate using these in an area that doesn't have any weather protection, particularly from the wind. So I like to set my teepee up in, you know, pretty heavily timbered little pocket, you know, some sort of geographic feature, you know, some sort of cliff band or something is protecting from the prevailing wind, I like to set these up there. It's not that these things are gonna get, you know, torn down from wind or bad weather. They're pretty damn tough. I've even been in them in quite a bit of snow and rain, you know, pretty good snow load they can take. You just got to knock it off of them. Nothing like a wall tent, but they're pretty damn good on that front. But with intense winds, the problem with these things, because of the length of their walls, if you're a light sleeper, these things will keep you up all night. Even honestly in like a mild wind, they just flap a lot. So for me, I'm a light sleeper. I'm a little bit of a pussy that way. That can be an issue with them. So if I'm taking this, I'm making sure I'm putting it somewhere where I'm protected from the wind just for that purpose. Huge bonus of this is that you can stand up. Come on in to my home away from home. All right, so this is what makes this setup the shit, is you're in the backcountry and you're in a backpack situation. You've limited, you know, weight, bulk, all of that good stuff, yet you can still stand up. You're not crawling around on your belly, you know, trying to get your clothes on without being able to stand up. You can stand up in this thing, and that's huge. It seems petty, but if you haven't done this a whole lot, you'll realize the value of that. Like the Hilleberg tents that I mentioned, or other really lightweight, above alpine, you know, those sort of backpack tents, they freaking suck on that front because you literally feel like you're constantly crouched over. You don't get to stand up. So teepees are absolutely awesome for that. All right, so a lot of people are gonna understand the value of these, but I'm gonna go over real quick. And this goes for not just elk hunting. If you guys are into survival stuff, bushcraft stuff, you gotta understand this. A dry heat source is huge. Even in arid climates like Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, that stuff, it's still very nice to have a stove because you can dry your stuff out. Even your own perspiration in your boots, it's hard to dry those out unless you have a dry heat source. Propane, other sort of heat sources, they're not gonna do it. You gotta have a wood burning dry heat source. This is the Kifaru medium stove. I've used this stove a bunch of times. This is actually a new one. I burned it in last night. You know, these things, they're lightweight, you know, particularly for what they are. So they all, you know, all the different manufacturers have their little quirks. There's things I like about the Argali stoves. There's things I like about the other little box stoves out there that are similar to this, but I'm comfortable with the Kifaru. It's never failed me. The one thing I will say about this teepee, a massive freaking downside, particularly if you're having to put it up in shitty conditions, shitty weather conditions, this is the hardest of the shelters I'm talking about to put up. But it doesn't matter if you follow the directions or not. Yes, once you get a feel for it, you get a lot better at it, but you end up just having to adjust it quite a bit. And there's a lot of stakes here, and you end up playing with it a bit. So it's not gonna take quite as long as a wall tent, but pretty close. Where some of the other shelters I'm gonna show you, they take hardly any time to put up. Now, one thing I'm gonna mention, because this is really important point for you guys to understand with shelters. I've been using this type of teepee for like, you know, 10, 15 years on lots of hunts, right? I know exactly how all the shit works. I know exactly how the stove works, but when you get a new one, there's a few things you gotta do. One, you gotta seam seal the tent, and then you gotta burn the stove in, right? And I burn the stove in just because if there's oil, grease, whatever on there, it burns off, and you get your pipe to form, and that makes the pipe a whole lot easier to form up in the field and get into your stove. You're not struggling to fight with the thing, particularly if you're by yourself, right? But you can make a critical mistake here, particularly if you have some familiarity with these shelters. I knew I had to do the stove, so I could have just burnt the stove in, and then I could have just seam sealed the tent flat, or I could have waited to put the tent up in the field in camp and just brought the seam seal with it and seam sealed it there, right? But you have got to test everything in the shelter before you go in the field. I'm literally in 3 days gonna get on a bush plane and go into the Selway of Idaho, and I'm planning on taking this teepee for those spring bear hunts. This pole right here, and this is not, I'm not trying to bust Kifaru's balls. For God's sake, I'm wearing their t-shirt, right? Like, I love their stuff. I've used their stuff, their packs, and their shelters a ton. But when I went to put this pole in yesterday, on the holes here, the adjustment holes, there was a burr on the inside of one. And what happened was when I put that pole in here, it got stuck. There is no way, absolutely zero chance that I could have got that out without tools. I had to use a pipe wrench. You can see a little marring here where I did that. Yes, a slight little manufacturing defect at home, no problem. Pulled it out with a pipe wrench, you know, worked that burr off of, now it works perfectly. If I would have flown in with this shelter into the Selway, for sure, the weather's gonna be shitty when you get in there. It's almost a guarantee. If you're flying into Alaska, same deal. When you show up, the weather's gonna be shitty. When you're trying to put your camp in, it's gonna be wet. I would have not had a shelter. Even if you're familiar with your shelter, do not set it up for the first time on a trip in the field, because little things can cause you lots of problems. But that's the teepee. This thing is great, but had to have been 15, 16 years ago, I shot at my first bull right next to one of these teepees because I called it in, really not by calling it at all. I was just breaking sticks to fit into that little stove there. And I'm sure that bull just thought I was raking, and he showed up right next to the tent. I missed him with my recurve. I remember shooting at him with one of those big, super sharp, hand sharpened Zwicky Eskimo broadheads. Missed him by 3 or 4 feet, but that was like my first like close encounter. I was probably, I don't know, 16 years old or something like that, but my first like archery close encounter. Key thing on using these stoves is make sure you don't skimp on your screens, because embers pop through these because you're burning hot fires and they come back on your teepee. You end up with holes, and then you end up with water inside the shelter. That goes for any shelter that has one of these cool little wood stoves. So that kind of covers the teepee. This is a classic, man. All right, so this wouldn't be a complete elk hunting backcountry shelter video without the tarp. This is for you dorks. All right, so I'm not the biggest glassing tarp user on the planet. I just don't find the use that so many other people do. I don't find that use case. I don't mind just glassing in good rain gear. I do that a lot. And this is another thing that you gotta carry. Yeah, they're crazy lightweight, and I'll get into that, but it's another thing you gotta carry. It's another thing you gotta dry out too. Like if it gets wet because you're using it in nasty terrain, now you've gotta dry it out, plus your rain gear, and plus you gotta pitch the thing, right? So I find that, you know, a squall comes in the mountains, okay, like let's get our tarp out, we put it all in, you know, half the time the clouds move off. Now, you know, we don't need to use the tarp. You're always dealing with the wind with them. There's a lot of things I just don't find that they're that useful for. But there are situations where it is nice to have one. I'm not going to claim otherwise at all. And, you know, one is just sun. If I know I'm going to be glassing for a super long time, like I'm going to go on spring bear hunts here, you know, in a few days, if, you know, it's super nice day and I get to a really good glassing spot and I know I'm going to be there for, you know, 8 hours, I'm going to glass, you know, the whole afternoon till dark. These things are pretty nice just to keep the sun off you. That sun saps the energy. And the other thing is they're damn good emergency shelters. Like, it's good to have an emergency shelter in your pack. There's no doubt about that. But I'm gonna bring you in here and show you the details of this one. This tarp that you're looking at right here is just a generic sil nylon tarp off of Amazon, not real expensive. Outside of the Dyneema tarps, I'm trying to think of the brand, Z-Packs, outside of like that tarp, which those tarps are really durable, a little more durable than this, and then they're half the weight. Outside of that, I found that all these tarps are for the most part about the same, honestly, in terms of function. The key thing with your tarps is you want them to be bigger than most people think, right? Or at least people who haven't used one. 9 by 10, 10 by 10, you know, maybe 8 by 10. That's the size you want. Don't get smaller, because it's exponential, you know, how much more volume you get in terms of, you know, where you can glass, the angles you can get out of it, and if you're using it as a shelter, how you can store your gear and sleep in here, given the size of the tarp. If you get much smaller than 8 by 10, man, they're useless, honestly. I don't even know why they sell them, but keep that in mind, that size does matter in this situation. I carry my tarp, all 4 corners rigged up with 6 to 7 feet of Dyneema. A lot of times, because I'll show you why, the way I pitch these, on one corner I'll put like 10 foot of line, just because it makes it a little bit easier. But I carry it with that line and then 6 or 7 stakes. And that's gonna cover, you know, trying to, you know, get this thing, you know, held up in pretty rough conditions. So I pitch it with that. A lot of times I use this method, which just takes 1 trekking pole. In terms of a shelter, tarps suck. If you get any weather, it doesn't matter how you pitch it. You can tell me, you know, how all the 90 different ways that you can pitch a tarp in whatever weather. They suck. They suck in intense weather. They suck in intense wind. And if you misjudge on a lot of these pitches how you pitch the tarp, you can have outright disaster if you're depending on it for your shelter, because there's certain ways you pitch them. If they get wind, they're like a sail. It doesn't matter how good your stakes are and all that. This shit is flying away, and you're going to be sitting there in your sleeping bag with no shelter. So keep that in mind. Now, let me show you how I pitched it, and then I'll show you how I use it. This way of pitching this thing literally takes like sub a minute, right? This corner, one corner right here with a line on it, tie it to a tree. That's the corner I typically have a little bit longer line, just depending on the type of tree that I need to tie it to. And then if I'm glassing out the front of this, which I'll show you, it's nice to have a long line where the tree is not right in your way. It could be on the distance where you can get angles around it, right? And so this is the long way of the tarp, and then each, you know, side here, I stake these out, and then I stake out the back right here. If I want added support, these interim stakes I'll stake in too. It needs to have these. And honestly, kind of the more the better, right? Particularly if you're gonna get funky with your pitches. The big negative of this type of pitch is, look, I've pitched literally a sail. And just the function of things, usually, you know, you're tying to a tree or whatever, there's gonna be some wind going up and down the canyon, maybe even thermals coming up during a hot day or whatever, and it can catch these things. So you gotta be really careful how you pitch it. And unfortunately, a lot of times, if you pitch it where it's perfect for glassing, like where you wanna glass, that tends to be where the wind comes from, or a wind quarters out of there or something, so you got to deal with that. You got to kind of, you know, find a happy medium, but fall on the side of avoiding the wind, or you're gonna have to repitch the thing. To be honest with you, during heavy precipitation, heavy snow, glassing's not that useful anyways. To be honest with you, like particularly during spring bear, right? Like I'm not gonna be glassing a bunch in the rain. A matter of fact, I'll be totally honest with you, if I get up and, you know, the first 5 hours of the day, it's gonna be pouring, right? I don't go hike somewhere, set up a tarp, and glass my balls off during the rain for spring bears. It doesn't work. You don't kill bears that way. They don't come out in the rain in general. I know somebody's gonna have an exception, but in general, they don't do that. I get, you know, particularly if you're progressively backpack hunting or something like that, and you know, you're not going back to somewhere, yeah, it makes sense to have the tarp, get it out, keep all your shit dry. That's really important. Totally agree. But there's pros and cons of this. In terms of a shelter, tarps for me, emergency only. I'm not sleeping in this shit. I've slept in these a few times and I'm not into it. If I'm gonna go sleep on a set of rams that we're gonna kill first thing in the morning, I'm taking a little Hilleberg backpack tent much more over this. These just don't hold up in the weather, not in the crazy shit. In the crazy shit, I don't want to be in a tarp. I want to be in a bulletproof backpack tent for those sort of situations where I'm really tight on weight and bulk. So, my thoughts on the tarp. All right, this is the last one I'll show you. And to me, this is like the personal pizza of backcountry elk hunting, right? This is just a medium-sized teepee, essentially. This is the Argali. This is the I'm probably butchering the name, but the 4-person starts with the A, has a B in it. That model. This for one guy in the woods, and yeah, you're gonna take a little weight penalty versus like 4 guys taking the big 8-man teepee. Yeah, there's gonna be a little weight penalty, but one guy, or you know, a couple guys that, you know, really can, you know, not be disruptive to each other when they're sleeping, this thing is badass, right? If it's 2 guys, weight's gonna be on the money, right? This thing's a great backpacking setup. You're not taking no penalty, any penalty. For one guy, yeah, it's gonna weigh a little bit more, but this thing is awesome, and I'll show you why. First, right off the bat, way easier to pitch than a round teepee from my perspective. It's substantially easier. Part of that is just the overall size. Part of it is the shape, but it's much easier to pitch without a doubt. And then the other part of that is it doesn't have as much of a wind problem. Again, part of that is the shape, but I think the vast majority of it is actually just the length of the wall. Best of both worlds. You got the floorless shelter, which that you have to have if you want a dry source of heat in there. basically, for the most part, you can't have a wood stove in a shelter that has a floor in it. There's some exceptions to that, but in the real world, this is the case. I like this tent with the insert, and you're taking a weight penalty. Obviously, if you didn't have that, then it would weigh less, but this thing is nice, man. You don't have to deal with any bugs or any shit like that. Look at that thing, right? Zip in there. You got your own little, you got your sleeping spot. Keep your gear clean, all of that. You know, keep your boots out here, you know, on the floorless section. Keep your boots away from your gear and your sleeping arrangement. You guys can totally see how big of a pussy I am. Backcountry, long duration. One guy, this is the shit. Two guys, it's doable. But you've got the dry source of heat here, floorless. You've got the inset here that keeps the bugs away from you. But the other thing is it gives you a floor in there so you can put your dirty boots, all your gear, all your dirty shit, throw it out here on the floorless section, keep all that dirt and crap away from where you're sleeping, and you're gonna sleep a whole lot better. But this thing is sweet. Pitches pretty easy, pitches on one pole, a great deal for one guy. And for me personally, because of the wind noise and the ease of setup in shittier weather, if I'm not splitting, you know, the weight amongst 3 guys at least, and even then it's iffy. If I'm splitting it with 4 guys, you know, and nobody's a snorer and I can sleep around them, sure, go for the Kifaru 8-man teepee. But outside of that, man, I'm all about this. So that was the rundown on 3 shelters that I think every backcountry elk hunter is gonna run into. My opinion on a lot of these, but it's based on a lot of hunts, dozens and dozens, and dealing with different situations. All this shit that I touch on, guys, like the wind against the walls, you know, the trade-off between one person or 2 persons, sleeping with a 4-person setup where, you know, there's people that snore, or maybe they're just moving around all the time, or their, you know, their pad is loud, all that shit matters. So consider these shelters in that context, you know, how you sleep, your personal behavior, your personal personality. It's not all about just bare bones on weight. If you do that, you're probably giving up something. For me personally, there's a place for each one of these, but I'm gonna use them based on not only the situation, where I'm gonna be pitching them, the duration of the hunt, but also on the dynamic of the group, right? I don't share shelters in situations where I think sleep is gonna be a problem. In that case, I'm all over this Argali setup. This thing's the Taj Mahal. In other situations, I'll use a teepee, I'll use that setup. I know a bunch of you guys are tarp fans. I gave you my opinion on it. Guys, if you enjoyed this video and you got value out of it, do me a huge favor, like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm gonna send you off with this video right here, why 5% of the guys kill 95% of the bulls. Go check it out. There's some tips in there that I guarantee will help you kill elk this next season. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys later.